Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. The subject of this week's episode is a bit controversial. He inspired a movement that some have criticized. He helped shape American poetry into what it is today. Some say for the better, while others say otherwise. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 16th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets Department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Robert Bly. Robert Elwood Bly was born on December 23rd, 1926 in Lackey, Parle County, Minnesota. So, he has a birthday coming up soon. That's happened a lot this season. His mother was Alice Myrtle Alls, and his father was Jacob Thomas Bly, and he had an older brother named James Ellison Bly. During his childhood, Robert spent most of his time doing chores on his family farm and reading. Robert was born into a Lutheran family. This episode is not going to be a super long one because there's just not as much to talk about with Robert Bly as there is like someone like Robert F. Kennedy or Clara Bow or Cleopatra. But I have said this before, I don't want the length of an episode to deter me from covering someone. And with this season, I didn't even get to pick who I covered. I left that up to Taylor Swift. But now going back to Robert. He enlisted in the Navy in 1944. He spent 2 years in the U.S. Navy. It was in the Navy at the end of World War II that he really discovered his passion. This is Robert, quote, "During a class on radar, my teacher wrote a poem as I watched. I had somehow never understood that poems were written by human beings, and I still remember that moment with delight." End quote. Robert then went to St. Olaf College in Minnesota. He went to St. Olaf College to become a doctor. He was there for a year before he transferred to Harvard University. His major became English literature at Harvard, and he learned Greek, Latin, and German. If you don't know this already, Robert's claim to fame was poetry. And when he transferred to Harvard, he was surrounded by other people who would go on to become famous writers, which included Donald Hall, Adrian Rich, Kenneth Cope, John Ashbery, Harold Brodkey, George Pimpton, and John Hawkes. Robert graduated from Harvard in 1950. Robert then spent the next 6 months alone in a cabin in northern Minnesota. He was hoping sparks of creativity would fly. Then it was off to New York for Robert. There, he struggled. He spent the next 3 years struggling. He had just enough money to get by. In New York, he wrote poetry and he did part-time jobs such as a typist, clerk, and a house painter. This is what Robert had to say about his New York years. Quote, "There's something backward about my life. So many things happen out of time. I suppose I spent, or wasted, much of my 20s alone in a New York room during the years I've described. At that time, I couldn't be a lover and an artist. So I decided to be an artist. Only." End quote. Robert met a woman named Carol McLean on a blind date. Robert and Carol married in 1955. They then moved to Robert's family farm near Madison, Minnesota. There they lived a simple and quiet life. When they moved there, the farm had no running water, which reminds me of the Clara Bow episodes when she moved into that shack. Robert and Carol did not own a television. Instead, they kept themselves entertained by reading the over 5,000 books in their personal library. And they also had many poet friends like Donald Hall, James Wright, and Bill Home over for visits. Their friends would have to help out with the chores around the house before Robert would feed them. Together, Robert and Carol had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. They named their children Micah, Bridget, Noah, and Mary. In 1956, Robert traveled on a Fulbright grant to Norway. There, he translated Norwegian poetry into English. Robert's parents were Norwegian immigrants. Robert had his early collection of poems published in 1962. It was titled Silence in the Snowy Fields. Robert would go on to publish more poetry and essays. One essay was titled A Wrong Turning in American Poetry. In that essay, he argued that the vast majority of American poetry from 1917 to 1963 lacked soul. He criticized poets like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Mary Ann Moore, and William Carlos Williams. Robert was like the subject of the last 2 episodes, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., and the fact that he also was against the Vietnam War. In 1966, Robert co-founded American Writers Against the Vietnam War. In 1968, he signed the Writers and Editors War Tax Protest Pledge. By signing it, he vowed to refuse tax payments in protest against the war. In 1968, he also accepted the National Book Award for The Light Around the Body. And in his acceptance speech, he said that he would be contributing the $1,000 prize to draft resistance organizations. That book is very anti-war. In the book, he attacks American foreign policy. Some of the titles of the works in that are Johnson's Cabinet Watched by Ants, Those Being Eaten by America, and Driving Through Minnesota During the Hanoi Bombings. His poem, The Teeth Mother Naked at Last, is an anti-war poem. The 1970s were big for Robert. He published 11 books of poetry, essays, and translations. These books celebrated myth, Indian ecstatic poetry, meditation, and storytelling. He was strongly influenced by someone that has made multiple guest appearances on this podcast, Robert Graves. He showed up in the Dylan Thomas episode and the Siegfried Sassoon episode, and I believe those are the only 2 episodes that he's made an appearance in. In 1975, Robert organized a Great Mother Conference. During this 9-day event, poetry, music, and dance were practiced to examine human consciousness. One of the major themes in the early years of the conference was the goddess or Great Mother. That conference has been held annually since 2003 in Noblesboro, Maine. It was thought that there needed to be a focus on the divine feminine because of the Vietnam War. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was felt that there needed to be a focus on what the contemporary man was going through. So, the new father was added to the conference title. Robert stopped going to the conference in 2010. The 1970s wasn't just a big decade for him professionally, but there was also some change in his personal life. His brother died on July 3rd, 1971. He met a woman named Ruth Council in 1972, and in 1979, Robert and Carol divorced. The following year, Robert and Ruth were married, and he became the stepfather to Ruth's 2 children. Robert moved to Minneapolis with Ruth in 1993. Robert was deeply saddened when his father died on July 1st, 1988. During this time, Robert began a series of seminars for men. Participants were encouraged to reclaim their male traits and to express their severely repressed feelings through poetry, stories, and other rites. This led Robert to the character Iron John. The character was based on a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Iron John would come to stand for an archetype that could help men connect with their psyches, and eventually Iron John was turned into a book titled Iron John, a book about men. In the book, Robert argues that modern men are greatly damaged by an absence of intergenerational male role models and initiation rituals. He says that boys need to be guided into manhood. Women don't need this because we have our menstrual cycles to tell us when we are an adult. But boys don't have anything like that, so they need to be guided. This work of nonfiction blamed the Industrial Revolution for taking adult men out of the home, thus destroying the essential bond between fathers and sons. So boys were not properly introduced to manhood because the father was not in the home, so it kept boys away from their fathers and masculinity, making them half men and making them weak. So Robert said that men needed to embrace their wildness because men had become too feminine. Though he did say that he was critical of the macho behavior. All of these ideas that Robert was spewing fueled the men's movement. His ideas led thousands of men to create male-only groups around the nation. At these meetings, men would gather around campfires, beat drums, and talk emotionally about their family relationships. Now, if you think that this point of view sounds anti-feminist, you would not be alone. Robert's work and the men's movement was called out and accused of being anti-feminist. One reviewer said that Robert portrayed women as, quote, a race of immaculators, end quote. Robert said that women made men soft and that women take away a man's warrior strength. Some viewed it as indulgence of white upper-middle-class baby boomers. The men's movement was made fun of by sitcom writers and cartoonists. They saw the men as childish. Now, to get into everything that the men's movement was would take a long time, and we would honestly lose the plot of the episode if we did that. And this isn't Wonderland, so let's not go down that rabbit hole. But just to give you a little bit of details, the men's movement fought for men's rights. There were men in the men's movement that believed that men and women were equally oppressed. Now, to be fair, this was not the view of everyone in the men's movement. The men's movement was filled with many different groups, and some considered themselves pro-feminism. This was Roberts' response to the backlash to the men's movement in a 2000 interview. Quote, "The media dismissed all this work as drumming and running in the woods, which reduced it to something ridiculous. I think the men's seminars were not threatening to the women's movement at all, but a lot of the critics of Iron John missed the point." End quote. Robert would take a few teaching jobs here and there to make a living, but he refused to take a permanent academic post because he said that it would dilute the strength of his writing. He would also translate poems from Scandinavian and South American poets for cash. In his career, Robert received awards. In 2000, he got the McKnight Foundation's Distinguished Artist Award. He was the University of Minnesota Library's 2002 Distinguished Writer. In 2002, he also received the Maurice English Poetry Award. And his book, The Night Abraham Called to the Stars, was nominated for a Minnesota Book Award. In 2006, the University of Minnesota purchased Robert's archive, which contained more than 80,000 pages of handwritten manuscripts, a journal spanning nearly 50 years, notebooks of his morning poems, drafts of translations, hundreds of audio and videotapes, and correspondence with writers like James Wright, Donald Hall, and James Dickey. You can find Robert's archive at the Elmer L. Anderson Library on the University of Minnesota campus. The university paid $775,000 for his archive. Robert was Minnesota's first poet laureate in 2008. In 2013, he was awarded the Robert Frost Medal. That is a lifetime achievement recognition by the Poetry Society of America. Robert published more than 40 collections of poetry, edited many others, and translated poems and prose from Swedish, Norwegian, German, Spanish, Persian, and Urdu in his lifetime. But not everyone was a fan of Robert's. Poet Dana Gioia said that Robert's success was not really about literary talent, but rather self-promotion. He called Robert's free verse translations, quote, "insensitive to both the sound and nuance of the originals," end quote. He said that Robert done immense damage to American poetry. Dana also wrote, quote, "Bly insists on being judged as a major poet, but his verse cannot bear the weight of that demand," end quote. In 2012, Robert's daughter Mary came out and told the world that Robert had Alzheimer's disease. He died in his home in Minneapolis on November 21st, 2021, surrounded by his children. He was 94 years old. He is buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Robert is the only one that I'm going to cover this season that was mentioned in a song that Taylor Swift was just featured on. Taylor co-wrote a song with Gracie Abrams, and Taylor is also featured on that song. The song that mentions Robert is called Us, and it is track 5 off of Gracie Abrams' second studio album, The Secret of Us. And that was the life of Robert Bly. Thank you so much for listening to the 16th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode is going to be about Marjorie Finlay. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give this shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode that I do. And at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier. Plus, you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Chef merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zip-Up hoodie. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you take out ad space on this podcast. I also have some affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. And if you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.